Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the webinar, Economic Justice for Victims. My name is Emily Thrush, and I'm the project coordinator here at Equitas, the Prosecutors Resource on Violence Against Women, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. Economic abuse is one of the many ways that abusers achieve and maintain power and control over their intimate partners. Economic insecurity and dependence on the abuser directly impact the ability of victims to participate in the criminal justice system. Addressing the financial impact of these crimes at all stages of the criminal justice process will improve the ability of victims to participate, assist the prosecutor to present a more accurate and compelling case at trial, increase the safety of victims, and help to ensure the offender is held accountable for the full range of criminal conduct. This webinar will explore the ways in which economic insecurity and economic abuse affect victims and will suggest strategies to achieve economic justice in cases involving intimate partner violence, stalking, sexual violence, and human trafficking. Before I begin the substantive portion of our program, I'll provide a few logistical notes. If you have any technical difficulties, please contact iLink directly at 1-800-799-4510. If you're using the internet audio option, we do recommend you dialing in with a phone since the connections are often more reliable. Throughout the presentation, if you're unclear about anything or you'd like clarification from the presenters, you can use the iLink hand raise indicator, which is located on the toolbar in the top left-hand portion of your screen above the presenter's photo and to the right of the conference call number. You can also chat me your questions using the private chat option on the left-hand side of your screen below the attendee list. I will share your questions with the presenters so they can be addressed either during the webinar or followed up after the webinar is over. Today's webinar is hosted by Equitas, the Prosecutors Resource on Violence Against Women, and the Economic Security for Survivors Project through funding from the U.S. Department of Justice, Office on Violence Against Women. Written materials, including a copy of the PowerPoint presentation and the presenters' biographies, will be emailed to you after the presentation. In addition, we are recording today's webinar for later viewing. Equitas' mission is to improve the quality of justice in sexual violence, intimate partner violence, stalking, and human trafficking cases by developing, evaluating, and refining prosecution practices that increase victim safety and offender accountability. Equitas staff conduct legal research, we provide 24/7 case consultation, host specialized or state-specific training events and webinars, and provide individual experts to jurisdictions and organizations, as well as publish resources on topics relevant to the prosecution of violence against women. The individualized assistance Equitas provides is data-driven and incorporates customized strategies that are easy to implement, resulting in prosecutors' ability to sustain effective practices and promote systemic change. The Economic Security for Survivors Project seeks to protect, restore, and enhance the economic security and safety of survivors of intimate partner violence, sexual assault, and stalking. Funded by the Office on Violence Against Women, they identify barriers that threaten survivor economic security and safety and offer solutions based on data and proven best result practices. The ESS project provides strategies, tools, and training to criminal justice system professionals, transitional housing, and other direct service providers, community institutions, and policymakers across the country to integrate an economic lens into their policies and programs supporting survivors. Today's presenters are Teresa Garvey, Attorney Advisor here at Equitas, and Malore Dusenbery, Associate Director at the Economic Security for Survivors Project. Terry is an Attorney Advisor with Equitas and presents on trial strategy, legal analysis, and policy, and ethical issues related to violence against women. Prior to joining Equitas, Terry worked for 22 years as an assistant prosecutor in Camden County, New Jersey. For 9 years, she was assigned to the Domestic Violence Unit, and for 5 of those years served as Deputy Section Chief of that unit. Terry worked closely with the Victim Witness Advocacy Unit to provide education to the public and community leaders who came into contact with domestic violence victims. Her jury trial experience includes the prosecution of domestic violence crimes, sexual assault and other violent crimes, drug offenses, property crime, hate crime, and official misconduct. Terry has also extensive appellate experience and has briefed and argued numerous cases in the appellate courts in New Jersey. As Associate Director of the ESS project, Malore provides technical assistance and training to groups that regularly interact with survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking. Her particular focus is on the criminal justice system and justice-based intervention. Prior to working at WOW, Malore consulted for the Rebecca Project for Human Rights, where she advocated for alternatives to incarceration for previously abused girls and domestic youth sex trafficking. Mallory has developed teen dating violence prevention programs for START Incorporated, which she then taught to middle schools. After receiving her BA from Whitman College, Mallory earned an MS in social policy from the University of Pennsylvania. And the full biographies for Teresa, Terry, and Mallory will be emailed to you following the webinar, along with a PDF of today's presentation slides. I'd now like to turn the floor over to Terry for the substantive portion of today's presentation.
Thanks, Emily. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm glad you were all able to make it over here this afternoon. I just wanted to add one thing in terms of if you do have any questions or something that you want to ask me or Mallory, if you would kindly direct those via chat to Emily, and she will interject them at the appropriate time. I just have trouble keeping track of my chat when I'm talking, so that would be very helpful if you can do that. And I'm really thrilled to be doing this today with Mallory. She's extremely knowledgeable, and I know that she'll have a lot to they have a lot of wonderful resources, which we're going to talk a little more about as well, that you can use in prosecuting your cases or in working with your victims. Our learning objectives today are, first of all, to recognize indications of economic abuse, and not only just the abuse itself, which is purposeful, usually on the part of the offender towards the victim as a means of exercising power and control, but also the incidental facts of life, poverty, discrimination, other kinds of nationwide factors that impact victims economically and inhibit their ability to participate in their cases. We want to be prepared to recognize and charge economic crimes when it's appropriate. And we'll look at some of the advantages of doing that and some of the strategies for doing that. And we want to be able to address economic barriers to safety throughout the criminal proceedings, particularly where it involves economic considerations. And I'm going to turn this over to Mallory for the first part of our presentation.
Great. Thanks so much, Terry and Emily. I'm thrilled to be here today talking with all of you and working with Equitas. They're such a fabulous resource and such a great friend of the S Project. So I think it's going to be a great hour that we're spending together, and we'll give you guys some great tools and information here going forward. So economic insecurity is directly related to survivors' safety and their ability to recover from violence, achieve independence, and really make decisions about the justice system. Addressing survivors' economic needs within the prosecution really will benefit all involved, including allowing survivors to be restored financially through economic relief, improving survivors' ability to cooperate with an investigation and hearing, and as we mentioned, holding offenders fully accountable for the full range of crimes committed. So on the S Project, there are really three main ways that we see economic insecurity and violence linked. First, economic insecurity and poverty can keep survivors trapped in an abusive relationship for longer because survivors do not have the resources to leave and thrive on their own. They can lack the ability to obtain medical care, secure housing, child care, and transportation, or take time off work to access the justice system. According to one 2012 survey of domestic violence shelters, I think done by the Mary Kay Foundation, 74% of victims stayed with an abuser longer because of financial reasons. And the longer that they stay, as you can imagine, the more at risk they are of violence, the economic consequences of that violence, and economic abuse by the abuser as a tool of power and control, which are the other two ways that we see violence and economics linked, and which I'm going to talk about a little more in depth in just a minute. So in addition to all of these, survivors must navigate additional economic barriers and costs related to the justice system itself. First of all, there are high costs associated with participating in the justice system process. These can include additional costs related to navigating transportation, child care, and time off of work for meetings and hearing, which, must be frequently rescheduled, unpredictable, and often, unfortunately, requiring waiting for an undetermined amount of time for these survivors to have their cases heard. So it really makes scheduling and planning ahead difficult. In addition to this is the potential court fees and attorney costs that they might have to face. The sanctions courts assigned to offenders may also affect survivors' economic security. For example, survivors may not want their abuser to be incarcerated because they might not be able to afford the interruption in employment and therefore financial support that they might be dependent on the offender for. And lastly, survivors may fear the consequences from their own involvement in the justice system, either through dual arrest, which we all know is much too common, or their arrest for crimes coerced by the abuser. Oftentimes, abusers exploit survivors for their own economic gain while seeking to protect themselves. And we see this with abusers forcing survivors to steal, commit fraud, sell drugs or sex, any of these things. And survivors may also be held accountable for economic crimes that abusers committed within their name, which is often a part of economic abuse. And if criminal action is taken against survivors, they might not reveal the coerced nature of these crimes due to threats from the abuser. And this all creates further dependency on the abuser in the future, while also creating barriers to getting, keeping, or advancing a job, being involved in a child's school or community activities, might even impact custody issues going forward if they have a criminal record resulting from all of this. So in all, the economic security or lack thereof, as is often the case of the victim, is extremely tied to their short and long-term safety and independence, as well as their ability to cooperate with the prosecution. All right, next slide, please. Thank you. So let's dive a little more into what the economic impact of intimate partner violence is, starting with the impact on employment. So whether from an offender's intentional actions or as a result of survivors having to take time off to recover, obtain health care, seek justice, any of these things, survivors lose an extremely high number of days of work a year, ranging from 7 for domestic violence to 10 for stalking survivors. And this adds up to an accumulative 8 million days of paid work a year in the U.S. And this missing work may lead to missed promotions or even job termination for survivors, especially if they're in hourly wage jobs or jobs that don't provide benefits such as leave for them to be able to take this time off that they need. Studies have found that anywhere from 24 to 60% of survivors had reported being asked to resign or fired as a result of abuse. And lost wages are really...
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, Evan.
No, I think I was jumping ahead of you. Go ahead. I think you were going to talk about it.
Okay. So I was saying that lost wages are really just one component of the high cost that survivors face. One study estimates that rape specifically can cost victims over $145,000 in physical and mental health care, lost wages, and justice system costs in their lifetime. And as you can imagine, this is probably on the lower end of cost estimates. So we can go ahead to the next slide, please.
I was just going to add here, I know that when I was prosecuting domestic violence, I had many victims who were fired or lost their jobs or had their jobs placed at risk just because of the offender's behavior. Employers were concerned that they were making the workplace dangerous, that sometimes coworkers or supervisors were actually threatened by the abuser. So those are kind of indirect impacts on the victim's potential employment, but they're very real. And sometimes those people wind up being witnesses in our cases too, and they don't want to get involved often. So our attempts to intervene can be good. I just wanted to also add, I just received a message from one of my colleagues who is presenting down at the National Advocacy Center on the National Institute for Prosecution of Sexual Violence in Indian Country. And just a few minutes ago, she said, one of the participants commented, I couldn't afford to be raped. I'm too poor to be raped. And not that people who are poor don't get raped, obviously, but the impact is just so great. And that was just someone who was participating in this conference who made that observation.
Great. Thanks so much, Teresa. That's an excellent point. And especially with some of those workplace impact when it comes to stalking, that's usually, one of the surest place that stalkers know that they can find their victims. So that's usually a big point of vulnerability for them, and it really does impact both the employer and the victim. And there's definitely avenues for collaboration and education of employers and how they can kind of help support the survivors' economic needs as well as their ability to participate in the justice system. So when it comes to housing, we all know that there are significant impacts related to violence or stalking. 28% of housing denial cases involve domestic violence victims who are denied housing because of the violence committed against them. And survivors may face eviction if law enforcement is called to the home, especially if they live in a jurisdiction with nuisance ordinances, or they may have to pay to have locks changed, doors or windows repaired, or security measures installed. And this is all beyond the cost of having to find new safe housing on their own, which oftentimes all of these costs can be prohibitive to safety. And unfortunately, we see this in the fact that over half of homeless women report having been physically abused by a partner. So another impact of violence and abuse is on survivors' education. And victims of dating violence, sexual assault, and stalking at school frequently see their grades suffer significantly due to the trauma response and the failure of the school to adequately respond, which can lead to lost scholarships and higher rates of dropping out. And this certainly impacts their chances to find higher paying and better jobs in the future, which, especially if combined with debt from student loans, has lifelong repercussions for their future economic security and stability. And this is just a snapshot of some of the potential unforeseen economic costs and consequences of violence. The CDC estimates that intimate partner violence costs society over $5.8 billion per year in terms of healthcare costs, lost productivity, and even death. So these are really significant issues that affect both individually and systemically.
If we think about the amount of justice resources that are put towards responding to domestic violence, if you just look at the criminal justice system alone, the police response, the judge's time, the prosecutor's time, the amount of overall resources that have to be expended that actually are expended on these cases, it's staggering.
Yes, definitely. And those working with survivors have really always recognized economics as a significant component of abuse and barrier to safety. And in fact, as we see here on this slide, economic abuse has long been a part of everyone's old favorite, the power and control wheel. And yet it's still one of the most under-addressed aspects by both service providers and the justice system. For those on the service provider side, this is largely due to a lack of resources and capacity. And on the justice system side, there's also a lack of awareness about the issues as well as what the different sectors can do within their job to address it. So before I turn it over to Terry to talk a little bit more about what specifically prosecutors can do, I want to talk a little bit more about economic abuse specifically. So economic abuse occurs when an abuser makes or attempts to make an individual financially dependent by maintaining total control over financial resources, withholding one's access to money, or forbidding one's attendance to school or holding a job. The tactics abusers use generally fall into these three categories that I have here on your screen: economic sabotage, economic control, and economic exploitation. And if you're looking at this list of the different forms of economic abuse, you may have noticed that many of these are actually crimes in and of themselves, such as theft, fraud, identity theft, and destruction of property. Sadly, there's a lack of data on the full extent and impact of economic abuse, but the available research that we do have from some smaller scale studies show that economic abuse is a very pervasive problem. Domestic violence programs in 10 different states reported that 88% of abusers controlled all finances and 73% of those abusers directly stole money. And a study evaluating the scale of economic abuse measure found that 99% of participants experienced some form of economic abuse. So the prevalence of these abuses, as well as their connection to criminal activity, makes it extremely relevant for the justice system in general and the prosecution specifically to address. And it can also help you start to see what the barriers are that survivors are facing, not only to leave an abuser, but to be able to participate in the system with you as you're trying to help them achieve justice and uphold accountability for the offender. So next slide. So lastly, it's important to understand and respond to the additional added challenges and barriers that certain underserved groups face. There's a couple ways that economics and victimization intersect here with huge impacts on safety. First of all, many of these victims face higher economic insecurity in general, whether it's fewer opportunities for victims of color, an inability to work or language barriers for immigrant victims, or low fixed incomes for elder victims. Higher economic insecurity means they are more vulnerable to abuse and have fewer options to leave, recover, and find independence. Secondly, whether they fear discrimination or the legal system itself, victims may be less likely to report, seek help, and access resources or protection. This is particularly true for victims of color, LGBTQ, and immigrant victims. And lastly, abusers often capitalize on these and exploit them for power and control. For example, abusers often threaten to have an immigrant victim deported or to out a gay partner, and abusers may take advantage of the dependency of older and disabled victims in order to, exert that control and create further dependency and take advantage of their economic situation in general. So justice system professionals and advocates must consider issues around access, outreach, and what you can do to overcome these barriers to support their safety and economic security. And actually, there's a number of great organizations working around these, but specifically focusing on the intersection of economic security and victimization. We on the S Project have a series of policy briefs dedicated to the additional challenges facing these and a couple other underserved groups, and they're available online, and you can access them later. So with that, Terry, it's back to you to dive in a little bit with the prosecution stuff.
Thank you. And I just wanted to add that you alluded to those policy papers on your website, which we are going to have a link to at the end of the presentation, and I highly recommend everybody go and explore those. If anyone is working on, especially any kind of legislative effort or appellate briefs where they need to talk about these kinds of issues, there's a wealth of statistics and information there that you can cite in support of providing economic security and justice for victims and survivors of sexual violence, domestic violence, and other gender-based violence. I don't know if any of you have had the opportunity to see this. It's a short video, and unfortunately we can't play it here. The technology won't allow us to, but it's the story of Rachel, and it's from a video that was produced by Praxis International, which provides safety audit information and a wealth of technical assistance and other kinds of support for communities in particular that are trying to improve their response to these offenses. But the story of Rachel it's about a 4-minute video, I guess. And I'm just going to summarize it. It is really all about what happens after the 911 call is made. Because as professionals, we tend to think in terms of, okay, the call is made, the police go out there, they take a report, they take statements, they collect evidence, boom, boom, boom. We don't see the case again often if we're in law enforcement or prosecutors. Advocates may be having more interaction with the victim in between these proceedings, but until we get into the courtroom. And then we are presented with a case. We have a case, we have police reports, we have a list of evidence, we have a victim, hopefully, but at that point, we start having our court proceedings, and eventually the case may or may not go to trial. But in the meantime, while we are living in this sort of time-lapse photography where we see, discrete events that take place weeks or months apart, our victim is living a day-to-day existence with a lot of stuff going on. And it all starts with that, well, it starts before the 911 call, but the ball rolling in terms of the justice system starts happening as soon as she makes that 911 call. And what you see through a series of little vignettes in this case is from the moment that call is made, Rachel's world is basically turned upside down. I mean, initially she's very relieved. She's calling her friend and saying, I finally did it. I finally called the cops on him. He's out of here. She's sounding very happy and relieved and relaxed for a moment. And then stuff starts happening. Life starts happening. And before you know it, you have things going on like the kid's dental appointment. And she's responsible for handling that on her own, including the expenses. There's a CPS investigation that happens as a result of this event happening in the presence of the kids, so now she's got to cope with all that. Meantime, the kids have school activities, after-school activities, various things going on that require her to drive around, to pick them up, to drop them off, to maybe pay fees associated with those activities. She's getting calls from the phone company about her phone maybe being turned off. She's getting a notice that, or looking at the calendar and seeing that her taxes are due. Meantime, she gets an eviction notice because she hasn't been real on time with her rent because the father of her kids, the man who she's been living with and sharing rent with, is now locked up. And she's getting calls from temporary aid to needy families. She's getting called in for custody and visitation hearings concerning the children. She's had to pawn a couple of her belongings. She's missed a couple of those payments. Meantime, she's got multiple legal proceedings going on pretty much at once. She's got CPS proceedings, either legal or quasi-legal, or judicial or quasi-judicial, CPS hearings, protective order hearings. She's got landlord-tenant proceedings concerning her potential eviction. So Rachel has so much stuff on her plate in really a matter of just a few months. And this is the ultimate caseworker's note. Rachel has become increasingly uncooperative. Well, is that really that surprising when you consider it? I'm thinking of our colleague's comment apparently this afternoon about I can't afford to be raped. I mean, that is one of the first things, not to minimize the fear, danger, trauma involved in a physical assault, but that's one of the things that would cross my mind, and I'm not economically strapped. I would be thinking, I can't afford to deal with it. Emotionally, I can't afford it. Time-wise, I can't afford it. In terms of time lost for my job, I can't afford it. And imagine how much more crushing that is if you're someone who is not at the top of the economic ladder. So I don't like the term uncooperative. I see it a lot. I sometimes even flip still and say it. But people use the word uncooperative or cooperative to describe witnesses, as if it were a matter of pure choice, as if the victim is sitting down and saying, well, I just don't feel like being cooperative, when in reality it is a crushing pile of overwhelming stuff that has landed on them. And we need to appreciate that. We need to appreciate that it's not a considered deliberate choice on their part whether to participate or not. It's really a matter of necessity and, what's most important, feeding the kids or going to a hearing. And that often shakes out in favor of feeding the kids. And we really can't be too hard on victims for making those kinds of choices. But what we can do is make it easier for them to engage in this process and to be heard and to have their input into it. So rather than use the term uncooperative, I like to use the word unable to participate because that's usually what it boils down to.
Right. Can I just jump in real quick there, Terry? going back to, what you were talking about the economic burdens that, so many people are facing, at Wider Opportunities for Women, we've done a lot of research around what actual costs people are facing down to the, county level and for all different kinds of family types, what it actually costs to meet basic needs these days. And what we're finding is that, of course, these are much higher than most, minimum wage jobs are able to cover, and that most people are not making that economic security level. They're not able to save for an emergency. They're not able to save for retirement. And then if something like this comes along, if something like domestic violence, or sexual assault, or stalking comes along, then, you're adding all of these other costs and burdens on top of that. So we like to use these tools to kind of show people in the communities and the justice system what people are facing, and if they, as advocates, as prosecutors, are barely making ends meet, how are we expecting these survivors to respond in the way that, we're expecting them to? So continue on.
Yeah, thank you. No, thank you. So inability to participate comes from, as we saw, a lot of different things. One is dependence on the offender's income. It may not be a lot, but two incomes are a lot better than one, and one is a lot better than none, depending on whether the victim is working or not. And she may have small children. It may be that what she is making would not exceed what she'd have to pay out in child care. So she may not be employed, and that may be the only income she has. The ongoing intimidation and coercion is endemic. If you've ever had a chance to listen to jail calls that your offenders make to their victims, and if you haven't done so, I suggest you start looking at those. There's a whole lot of emotional manipulation that goes on in those calls. The victim may be visiting the offender at the jail, and he may be working on her in person. And offenders don't just use these heavy-handed threats. They use a lot of really subtle emotional manipulation. Poor me. Look at this horrible position I'm in. I miss you so much, honey. And there are some wonderful resources on that kind of manipulation, which is not what we classically think of as intimidation, but it has the same effect and the same goal. Fear of involvement with the justice system. Remember, a lot of people don't trust the justice system from the word go. They think that police officers play favorites, that there are certain people who get justice and certain people who don't, and victims often feel that they're in the group that don't. They may have their own issues, legal issues. They may have outstanding warrants. They may be engaged in illegal activities at the offender's behest or under pressure or manipulation from him. So there's a lot of reasons why victims are reluctant to even, get within 100 yards of a police officer or a courthouse. They face these overwhelming life and financial circumstances, like we saw with Rachel, where just everything seems to implode when the offender is arrested. Now, even though the victim feels initially like this is the answer, it's actually only opening up a whole new can of worms that she now needs to deal with. Whereas when the offender was hitting her or verbally abusing her, or the actions may have been, she at least kind of knew what to expect. And maybe most of the injuries were not things that required hospital stays, and she felt like she could cope with that. And the rest of it, though, may be just too much to deal with. In addition, often victims have these multiple parallel proceedings kind of going along at the same time, as we saw with Rachel. And as Malore mentioned, that includes, as a result, the victim losing time from work. There may be legal expenses if they're civil matters and the victim has to pay an attorney, or even if they're paying on a sliding scale, it's still an additional expense. May have to pay filing fees for documents filed with the court, child care, transportation, all of those add up. And we do have another presentation that I recommend if you haven't had an opportunity to see it, called Criminal Meets Civil, and it's about the intersection of the criminal and civil justice system in these cases. So that adds a whole other dimension to it. So one of the things that happens is when a victim calls 911 and she's been beaten or she's been raped or she's reporting a stalking or the police uncover a trafficking situation, often the police are focused on evidence to support that crime. But they don't always broaden their scope, and they're doing that more and more now, and it's really great when they do because it's so helpful in painting a full picture for the jury of what the victim is dealing with, that they don't always look beyond that to other evidence of power and control. And as we've seen, economic abuse is a huge factor in that. By finding this evidence, asking for it, obtaining it, preserving it early on, then we are strengthening our case because we are able to show a full picture to the jury of why the victim didn't leave, why maybe she left before but went back to the offender, why maybe she's dropped protective orders or criminal cases in the past. And it holds the offenders fully accountable. We're not just saying, oh, as long as you don't hit her or as long as you don't rape her, then we're not going to hold you accountable for anything else. If we are obtaining that evidence, then we can charge those economic crimes and hold the offender accountable for the full range of conduct. The other thing that this evidence does is it helps to support claims for restitution at the conclusion of a case, or civil relief, such as obtaining relief as part of a protective order, or if the victim chooses to file a lawsuit against the offender and he's not judgment-proof, it can help to support a case there. And it's important to realize that by engaging victims early on with these help that we can offer them, advice, direction, resources, we will be increasing their ability to participate, and we will be enhancing the likelihood that we will be able to get this evidence. Because most of this evidence is in the possession of the victim, and we are never going to know about it if the victim shuts down, if she feels so overwhelmed that she can't participate and she stops talking to us. So all of it fits together. It all works together and weaves together to help us build a stronger case and hold the offender accountable and provide the maximum support and safety to victims that we can. Malore, do you want to pick it up here?
Yeah, I'd love to. Sure. So whether it's done by a system-based advocate or the prosecutor, there are a couple economic-related questions that are important to ask up front because they're largely directly related to victim immediate safety and will ultimately help support their participation. So by asking whether the offender has any of the victim's property or destroys anything needed for safety, you're really able to make a big difference to the survivor by taking steps to get their property returned and connect them to community resources to ensure their safety. This will significantly reduce their vulnerability to further abuse and witness intimidation, and will also increase their trust in the justice system. So just starting by asking, is there anything you need to stick with me on this case? Just, simple, open-ended question will often reveal economic concerns at the forefront of the victim's mind. It will also signify that you understand them, what they're going through, what they need, and it will increase the likelihood of their sticking with the prosecution. So in fact, we have one story about a Pennsylvania prosecutor who told us about 2 domestic violence cases. In one, the victim was financially dependent on the abuser, as we often see after years of economic abuse, and really feared that she and her children would be destitute if he went to jail. As a result, she lied about the abuse and convinced her children to lie on the stand, and they lost the case. Whereas in the other case, the victim was even more dependent on the abuser and, lived above the business that they owned with him and his family, and it was just, very messy, dependent situation. But prior to the trial, the prosecution team helped her find a place to live, start classes, and obtain financial support. And as a result, she felt independent enough to provide honest testimony, and that prosecutor attributed that as to why they won that case. So these actions to protect the victim's economic security don't require a huge effort from prosecutors. You know, we're not asking you to completely go above and beyond here. But there's really simple, small steps that you can take that make a huge difference. Did you have something to add?
I was just going to say, I think when we started this, you mentioned prosecutors and advocates. But of course, we have law enforcement on this as well. And these are things that first responders can ask, any first responder.
Right.
And from a law enforcement standpoint, things like, has the offender taken any of your property, that may give you a clue of what you might find when you catch up with the offender, things that you can look for.
Yeah, definitely. And it's, so beneficial to arrange to have a law enforcement officer accompany the victim to get their possessions that they need from their home safely and securely, so that they, don't put themselves at risk. And advocates within the justice system, as well as prosecutors and law enforcement, can write letters to employers, landlords, and educators, reminding them about, any laws that ensure survivors are able to participate in the justice system and stay safe. So there's a lot of jurisdictions that have laws allowing victims to take a set amount of time off of work to meet with law enforcement prosecutors, appear in court, or seek victim services or legal assistance. And even if one lives in a jurisdiction without these policies, a simple letter from law enforcement or prosecutor's office explaining that the victim is cooperating with the justice system and asking the employer to give the victim time off to assist the state may still protect them from retaliation or job loss. Similar efforts can be made with educators to protect victims placed in schools, and with housing providers to protect victims from being evicted, or to help them break a lease without penalty, or change their locks, kind of take some of those small steps that make a huge difference. Next slide. So because all survivors respond to trauma differently, and some survivors may need time to process and then later respond to some of the deeper economic questions, discussing the economic impact should be an ongoing process. It shouldn't just be those initial questions from the first responder. It really should be included and integrated into investigation protocol and follow-up interviews, because in addition to safety planning, these questions may also reveal additional crimes committed that the prosecution can charge, what evidence may need to be collected, and what release the victim is eligible for. So many victims may not be aware of the full extent of economic abuse or economic impacts of the violence. So prosecutors and advocates can really help victims think through the answers to these questions rather than just giving them a form to fill out on their own. They can also connect victims with the proper resources, such as crime victims compensation or other public benefits, and help them limit the abuser's financial access to them if needed, such as if the offender has access to the victim's money and financial information, then, that's a really great place to start kind of helping victims know to change their passwords, account information, et cetera. So,
and also, when we're talking, when we ask the questions about how the abuse has affected you financially, giving some suggestions like the medical bills, increased security, repairs to damage, missed work, may help victims think about the impact that it's had on these issues in a way that they might not immediately come to mind. So it's important to kind of, focus them on those kinds of issues so that they are including that when they are writing their victim impact statement or their restitution request as well.
Right, exactly. As we know, offenders are very creative, and there's a vast swath of economic impacts and economic abuses and manipulations that, we haven't even touched on, or, so it's important to kind of tease out some of these issues and get the juices flowing and thoughts going to really get the full scope of this for victims. So here are a few other examples of questions to ask victims that may impact the scope of your case as well as their safety planning needs. I should briefly mention that the less question about, the victim committing any acts that they're worried about is tricky due to issues with disclosure and confidentiality and should be considered carefully and discussed with advocates, of course. So I also want to mention that the S Project has created justice system guides that we have linked to at the end, but we have a lot of, we have some pocket guides for victim advocates and prosecutors, as well as a number of checklists to kind of get you thinking about what kind of questions you could be asking to assess these issues. So I encourage you to use those if you find them helpful. So in terms of documentation, there's a great deal of evidence that can be collected to support charging for economic crimes and requesting economic relief for the victim. Some law enforcement should already be collecting as part of their initial response and investigation, such as photographs of injuries and damaged or destroyed property. Other evidence may be uncovered as you discuss the economic aspects of the case with the victim and other witnesses. Online searches to uncover stalking or surveillance may also reveal, online fraud or theft. Proof of missed work or school can come from HR records, leave requests, security logs, or school attendance reports. Victims can provide documentation of the value of property, bills, bank statements, credit reports, and other financial documents. So as Terry mentioned, the victim will really help guide you as you determine what documentation will be needed, and then the victim and advocate can help you pull all that together to really support the case in the best way possible. So I'm going to turn it back over to Terry to talk about using this information to charge and present a stronger case.
Okay. Just also, when we're talking about victims' property that might be in the offender's possession, it's important to keep in mind that if it's not seized and logged as evidence, it's going to go into the jail with him and probably be released to him when he posts bail. So I've had a couple cases where that's happened. It's important if we know that he may be in possession of the victim's property, or if he's arrested and you suspect it is, that you confirm and make sure that anything that does belong to her is logged as evidence. So we talked about charging economic crimes. Some of the benefits of that, it will assist the victim in obtaining restitution or other kinds of civil relief. It may assist in negotiating with creditors or landlords or employers. And we have to do this with the victim's consent, because it may be if we interject themselves, they may feel like they're under the radar right now, but if we make a big deal out of it, then it's going to be worse for them. So we want to make sure that it's okay with the victim before we do that. But we may be able to help intervene if they're being done for debts, or if they're being evicted, or if their job is in jeopardy, to attempt to intervene with those individuals so that the victim is not unduly impacted. It may be in some cases that economic crimes will be easier to prove even if the victim is not participating or not participating actively in the case. If she's willing to acknowledge property belongs to her, even if she's minimizing the assault, those kinds of things. Of course, it will vary from one case to another whether you're able to prove that without the victim's testimony, because in some cases you are going to have that kind of proof. But there may be other ways of proving it. It's also important to note that to the extent that you have criminal charges for these economic crimes, you don't then have to file a 404B motion, which is the motion to admit evidence of other crimes or bad acts, because it's actually part of your criminal case. And that way you're painting a full picture for the jury of the conduct that has been going on. Economic crimes, when they're charged and when we're presenting evidence of it, it also helps to explain victim behavior. You may be calling an expert to explain why the victim recanted, or why she went back to the abuser, or why she didn't leave, or why she delayed reporting. And having evidence of that economic abuse and having the crimes actually charged gives that more weight. It may also support a motion for forfeiture by wrongdoing if the victim is unavailable for trial. Forfeiture by wrongdoing is where the victim or the defendant engages in some kind of conduct to prevent the victim from testifying in a case. It allows any hearsay statements by that victim to come in. So we have a lot more information on forfeiture by wrongdoing on the Equitas website, but it's just important to note for now that these economic crimes may help to support that forfeiture motion. And again, it ensures that the offender is accountable for the full range of everything he's done. Some of the economic crimes that we're talking about can include theft or robbery. I had a very, very serious assault case that went on where the abuse went on for approximately 18 months. And one of the things that the offender did at one point was force her to sign a check for a trust account that she held over to him. And he was pointing a gun at her when he did it. I charged him with robbery. And when you think about it, robbery is generally theft plus any degree of force. So if you've got the evidence to support it, go ahead and charge it. Vandalism, very, very common. Destruction of the victim's property or things that are really important to her. Identity theft, computer crimes, criminal coercion, witness intimidation crimes, including witness tampering and obstruction of justice. And that might consist of threats to leave the victim penniless, for example, even if he doesn't actually carry through that threat. It still may be witness tampering if that's a way to try to manipulate the victim into testifying his way. Forgery, very, very common. Burglary and trespass, fraud, evidence tampering. In connection with burglary and trespass, of course, victims may expend money that we will be seeking in restitution for upgrading their security system. They may be installing cameras, having locks changed, evidence tampering, false documents, stalking, cyber stalking, and electronic surveillance. Those can all have economic consequences and should be charged when we have the evidence to support it. Just keep thinking outside the box and broaden your view of the relationship and the criminal conduct that's going on beyond just the initial presenting problem. We want to engage in regular check-ins with the victim because we know that things change. They may be staying the same, but there's also constant updates. And if the victim is feeling supported, she's going to be much more likely to be willing to keep talking to us. We can find out what happened since the last time we talked. Is the offender in contact with you? Does he call you from the jail, or do you visit there? And then you can follow up on jail recordings or visitor logs. Have you discovered or remembered any other ways that this has affected you? People who are traumatized often don't remember things right away. But as time goes on, they remember more and more details. And finally, remembering to ask, is there anything you need to feel safe where you are right now? And that helps ensure their ongoing safety throughout the criminal justice process. Experts can often be helpful in these cases, experts in the dynamics of abuse or victim behavior. Consider in these cases, though, whether it might be more effective in a particular case to have the victim herself explain how she felt and what her reaction was. It's going to vary from one case to another, including on whether the victim is able to testify or not. It may be you'll be calling a trafficking expert in a human trafficking case. You might have complicated financial documents that we'll want to engage a forensic accountant for. Technology experts are very helpful in cyber stalking cases or computer fraud. And consider in cases where you have immigrants or native victims who the jury may not understand the cultural considerations that are impacting them. Consider calling those an expert in the culture, the victim's culture, to explain how the offender's behavior would have impacted this specific victim with this specific cultural background. Plea negotiations, it's important to know that even though it may seem easier, offenders may be more willing to plead to an economic crime than a violent crime, consider whether it's appropriate. places where it may be decidedly inappropriate is where you, for instance, have a dangerous batterer who wants to plead to an economic crime so he doesn't lose his right to possess a firearm, or where you have an offender who poses an ongoing threat to victims or to the public. The bottom line is it's important to consider all the collateral consequences and other circumstances before agreeing to dismissal of a violent offense in favor of an economic one. But in some cases, a victim will find plea to an economic crime more satisfying than a plea to a violent crime, better in overall outcome for them. So it's important to consider it, but don't just do it knee-jerk because it's easy. We want to make sure if we do that, regardless of what the offender pleads to, that we include economic relief restitution as part of the plea. At sentencing, we want to make sure that the victims have provided all the evidence we need for the court to order full restitution, a victim impact statement. We want to make sure also that if there is perhaps insurance that pays for part of the damage or part of the economic impact, that the victim, restitution to the victim is prioritized in the court's judgment over that of the insurer. It may be important for insurers to be made whole as well, for the offender to be held accountable, but for the victim it's much more important that they are paid first. Request economic relief if you're getting a protective order as a criminal protective order as part of your criminal proceeding, and provide the victim with the judgment of conviction detailing any court orders, including information concerning who the offender's probation officer is or where they can get that information so that they can know who to contact if they are having economic problems caused by the offender during the course of any probation. We want to make sure that after sentencing we don't stop, that we monitor compliance with probation or parole conditions, including restitution, and that those conditional releases be violated where the offender has the ability to pay but isn't. We want to offer victim documentation from our files that may be helpful in any civil cases or civil proceedings they may have or disputes with creditors and so forth to prove that they were in fact victimized. And we want to be providing ongoing services or referrals to programs to enhance safety and economic security. And Mallory, do you want to talk a little bit about coordinated community response? I know we're getting a little close here.
Yeah, I would love to. I could talk about this for days, but I will keep it very brief for you here today. So before we wrap up, I just want to say that while prosecutors have an incredibly vital role in addressing survivors' economic security and promoting economic justice, survivor safety and offender accountability are best achieved through a systems-wide response in which everybody is on the same page and collaborating to their fullest ability. Each sector has distinct and important roles that they can take to support survivors, some of which will function independently while others will directly intersect and support the work of the prosecution. So, for example, victim advocates are often working to support survivors' housing and employment, as well as their transportation and child care needs, all of which make survivors more stable and able to participate in the process. But they can also inform survivors about and prepare them for the justice system process, work to prevent victim witness intimidation, and help survivors think through and collect that evidence and fill out forms. So I have examples of, like that for all of these different sectors. But the, long story short is that it's important for prosecutors to be involved in multidisciplinary and coordinated community response teams, for there to be collaboration and communication between everyone, and for these groups to actively include economic concerns. All involved should consider survivor needs and wishes as it relates to economic security and safety, as well as consent and confidentiality issues. Cross-training and open lines of communication are extremely valuable for all involved, from the survivor to you in the justice system. And I encourage you to seize and build upon these options at every opportunity. And then I'm always here if you want to talk about these issues more. So, Terry, back to you for your closing remarks.
Yeah, so going forward,
we want to engage victims to improve their ability to participate in the criminal justice process. We want to investigate, charge, and prosecute economic crimes where they exist and to actively look for them, and to address economic security issues throughout the life of the criminal case. And what we have at the end here is a link for the resources that are available for the WOW Online. Do you want to just talk real quickly about what these resources are? Because they're awesome. I've looked at them.
Thank you so much. As I mentioned earlier, we created a set of justice system guides around how to integrate these economic concerns into the course of your work. So trying to be very practical, very hands-on, offer as many tools as we can. So lots of checklists and recommendations, both for working through an actual case as well as some of those bigger policy protocol collaboration pieces as well. So I encourage you to look, use them. They're all free. And then I also want to mention that we are available for free technical assistance either over the phone or in person. If you would like, please feel free to contact me if you have any questions, comments, case studies, etc. I'd love to talk to you. So.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I'll turn it over to Emily to wrap up here.
Thank you both to Terry and to Mallory, and thanks everyone for your participation today. We appreciate you coming online, and like we said at the beginning, this will be a recording, and I'll send out the slides so that you have access to all of these great links and resources that they just were talking about, as well as the rest of the material and the full biographies for the presenters. So thank you so much for your participation today. Remember that Equitas is around for 24/7 technical assistance, and we're able to provide responses to your questions, concerns, and needs, training needs. And I also just look forward to working with both of you all again. And yeah, have a good afternoon.
Great. Thank you both so much.
Bye-bye.